Hey everyone, I'm going to do my presentation of my analysis of leader communication in the article I found about the cheating in Atlanta's school district and the scandal that occurred. So first, I'll start off with the summary of the case. In order to understand what was going on with this situation, you kind of have to understand the political climate involved. So, in 2002, the federal government passed No Child Left Behind, which set up some high expectations for schools. The big goal, of course, was to leave no child behind. So they wanted to ensure that all students were getting good education, that they were being proficient in math, reading, science, and so they connected student performance on standardized tests to funding. So before this, there wasn't as big of an emphasis on standardized testing, but this kind of instigated that. The other important element is the person you see in the picture here at the bottom, and that is a woman named Beverly Hall. And she was the Atlanta, Georgia School District superintendent. And after No Child Left Behind was passed, she led the Atlanta School District with a very business-like approach. She actually set performance objectives for her schools that were tougher than federal law. So part of No Child Left Behind was that if your school wasn't showing progress, like say you started with 50% of your students proficient in English, if a higher percentage weren't proficient that next year, there were different consequences, like your school could lose funding, or they may have to they may have to do different things to show that they're trying to get better. And so she set her bar for her school districts even tougher. And she even tied teacher evaluations to student performance on standardized tests. So how well you did as a teacher was kind of determined by how well your students did on these tests that they were given. So what happened? Well, the ethical issue started occurring in 2006 at Parks Middle School in Atlanta, Georgia. This is a school in a very low income neighborhood. There's a lot of high poverty, a lot of high crime. And so it was a very struggling school. It had been classified as a school in need of improvement for the previous 5 years. And so in 2006, that school district, this middle school, was told that they would close. They would close their doors unless 58% of their students passed the math standardized test and 67% passed the English or the language exam. And so, obviously, very high stakes for those individuals. Now, the leadership their new he was kind of a new principal. His name was Christopher Waller, and so he goes into this school knowing that he may not have a job or he may have to move if they don't pass these state standards. And supposedly he had heard that the elementary schools that had been feeding students into Parks Middle School had been changing students' answers on standardized tests in the past. So these students who were going into the middle school a majority of them had never probably been proficient on those different assessments or skills, even though maybe their test scores said that they were, which of course would have looked, if that was happening, would have looked bad for the middle school. It would have looked like they were proficient in elementary school. What happened then when they went to the middle school and are no longer proficient? So this principal asked his teachers to do the same to the students' tests. He said, you know what? Look at some students who are close to that passing mark. If you can erase some of their answers, go ahead and do so just to make sure that they're at least proficient. So he asked his teachers to do the same. And so we know that he did this. There were several teachers later when this was discovered. One such teacher is Damini Lewis. He was a math teacher. And so he empathized with his students. He had grown up in a similar situation as these students. And so he was kind of, according to him, he was easily persuaded to go ahead and cheat on these standardized tests because he didn't want these students to, if the school closed, they would have to get bused to entirely different schools that would have been farther away. They also would have been split up from their classmates, the students they had been going to school with for several years. And he also thought that them seeing themselves as failures on these tests would lead to them believing, why do I try? And that would just kind of begin that cyclical snowball effect where they would no longer try and set these students up for long-term failure. So Lewis and other members at Parks Middle School, other staff members, they changed answers on the students' standardized tests from 2006 to 2010. So for 4 years, they were doing this, and the school's test scores looked like they were doing well. Everybody was kind of applauded as, oh my gosh, look at this school in kind of this low-income neighborhood. They're improving, and they kind of held them up as this model school of how to improve. However, in 2010, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation found out about this. And so I looked up a couple different things. The article I read said 110 teachers confessed or were accused of this cheating, and they were placed on administrative leave. Other articles said that it was even more teachers. I'm not sure how many teachers worked at this particular school, but needless to say, a large amount of teachers were placed on administrative leave after this investigation. There were also some criminal charges placed, which we'll talk about in a second. So it was a really big scandal. Obviously, a lot of ethical issues at stake here. So let's analyze what happened with this cheating scandal in terms of leadership communication, what they didn't do well, maybe what they should have done better. So to begin with, there were, obviously at the federal level, the idea of No Child Left Behind had several leadership communication failures. So the mandates of No Child Left Behind, and probably its biggest complaint is that it didn't receive enough input from their followers, which in this situation, it's teachers. And so because there weren't, very many teachers involved, it was hard. I feel like with No Child Left Behind, it was kind of this is a magic, we'll just do this, we'll test everybody will know we're being tested, and so that will keep you accountable. Well, the problem with that is that the problem they were facing, which is indeed a problem, that students aren't achieving. There's many students that, fall in the cracks, many schools that aren't as high performing, but they treated that as more of a technical challenge rather than an adaptive challenge. And so right there, that was an issue, is they thought, okay, let's just give them this test, which is kind of, they're not asking for complete systems overhauls, which an adaptive challenge would require. So the fact that they treated it that way was one problem. The other problem is that in many instances, they didn't give the work back to the people. They kind of mandated what those teachers, each school was going to have to do without getting their own input so that they had buy-in in that situation. So you had a lot of people that were not on board because they saw it as more work. They saw it as, well, this isn't helping education or learning if you're just testing these kids to death. And so it became issues, the whole idea of teaching to the test rather than well, what are the students learning and focusing on the learning. Now, I do think that at its basis, No Child Left Behind, it has some elements that are good. Like they attempted to get on the balcony to see the big picture. They did try to identify the challenge, like, hey, it's hard. We have a lot of kids that need help. They just didn't have a good enough follow through. Okay. There were also obviously leadership failures at the top. So Beverly Hall, the superintendent of Atlanta, Georgia School District, she took a very transactional approach to an adaptive challenge. So she was a business person. She dealt with complex problems and people, but she treated it like machines. And she even made the stakes that these schools were facing even higher, which of course that's going to increase the stress that teachers, principals, students were facing. And she really failed to regulate that distress, which is a key element of adaptive leadership. And that built fear in teachers. And so her followers were compliant perhaps, but they certainly didn't buy in with what she wanted them to do. They knew that she was going to follow through. And so that was that fear of, we better do this or else here's our consequence. We also had leadership failures at Parks Middle School itself. So Christopher Waller, that's the guy in the book thing, he was the principal. And he seemed to have very transformational leadership elements and behaviors. When I looked into him more, he was very charismatic. He took risks, which he took a risk asking his teachers to have to cheat. But he was able to earn his followers' trust. They trusted him so much that they agreed to do an unethical practice. They followed what he did. But he also has very pseudo transformational leadership characteristics. He lacked morality. He asked them, obviously, to do something that he knew was wrong. He was secretive. He was not transparent. And a lot of what he incorporated was kind of this Machiavellianism, which is where the end justifies the means. Hey, teachers, get your students, go ahead and cheat for your students because we want to keep our school, open. And so he was kind of placing blame rather than finding solutions. I also think it's funny, after he faced a felony charge for this, and he faced jail time, he ended up just having to pay like $50,000 for this, and he had 1,000 hours of community service, and he kind of ended up, he used that charisma. He wrote a book. He's now a pastor somewhere for kind of a big church in Atlanta. So he kind of came out on top to a certain extent. And so these leaders that we had here, they had an immense impact on their followers. So for teachers like Damone Lewis, who was the math teacher, as you see the guy here in this picture, they didn't have much of a moral guide via their leadership, so they relied on their own. And he believed that he was doing what was best for his kids. And other teachers like him likely acted out of fear. They were afraid for themselves, so their own jobs. They were also afraid for others. They were afraid for their students. So there was multiple situations. So they were kind of, none of them felt powerful enough to stand up apparently to this. And I don't know, I should look into more if maybe one of them did eventually, if that's how they found out, is that there was a whistleblower, I'm assuming at some point. So at some point, one of those followers realized like this is not right and had to go forward. But that's what happens when you have a leader that doesn't lead by values and those more moral issues. So what probably should have happened? I believe that a more adaptive leadership approach in these situations obviously would have been more beneficial for these schools, and hopefully you could have avoided such a thing. So if the superintendent, if the principal would have utilized adaptive leadership, yes, they would have stayed focused on the big picture, which is we need to improve students. Like no matter where our kids start, how do we aid their learning? How do we help them to do better? And so keep that as at the forefront, but they need to realize that it's an adaptive challenge. So, erasing answers and writing in the right ones, that's not a adaptive solution. That's a technical solution where you're not making them smarter, you're not giving them more skills, you're just getting them through a test. So they failed to identify those adaptive challenges and to do any systemic changes to their schools. They also failed to regulate distress. So if they had done that, if they would have, understand, hey, we're going to give you some leeway. These are our goals, and then give the work back to the people, so they felt empowered, and so that teachers could say, okay, logistically, this is what we know can work. This is what we believe could help with our population of students. I think you would have gotten more buy-in. You would have gotten better ideas. You would have actually, hopefully gotten practices that would have aided learning rather than just scores on a test. And that goes back to protecting leadership voices from below. So these individuals should have protected the teachers. Maybe they should have protected the parents, or in fact, the students, because now if the students are part of this, they probably always forever feel as though I was part of this scandal. What I did in middle school really doesn't matter. My learning there, it was all fake. So they needed to make sure that they were protecting all of those voices. So had those things happened, hopefully more would have been done and you would have had better learning. So that was my presentation. Here's my references. Thank you for listening.